Episode 16, Foreign Policy Study Tips.
The Anarcho-Christian Podcast, evaluating the relationship between the Christian and the state.
I'm rising up with a full heart. I'm taking my strength from inside. I'm rising up with a new mind. I'm taking your words to the new behind. I'm coming up from underneath the wreck, from underneath the...
Hi everyone, welcome back. Today is a discussion with Adam Graham of NoKingButChrist.com. It's one of my favorite blogs as Adam keeps me updated on events in our country's foreign policy and offers a particularly special perspective that is directly related to the blog name No King But Christ. So obviously we have a lot in common, and I think that you'll enjoy his perspective as well. But before we begin, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button on whatever podcatcher you're using so not to miss any future episodes. And if you're not sure where to find us, visit anarchochristian.com/subscribe. There you'll find links to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Android, Google Play, and YouTube. And I'm excited that this episode I have several iTunes reviews for you. The Goldmans writes, Stephen puts in work. Hard to argue logic with great citable information to look up on your own. Highly recommended for anyone. Thank you, Goldmans. I really appreciate that. Love the podcast and the content. From FB Wise. A principled and logical look into the intersection between a stateless society and a Christian society. Great intro music. Audio quality could be better. I do appreciate that, FBWise, and I'm always thankful for criticism. That is what will make us continue to bring a better product to you, and the quality of the audio, especially from the interviews, is something I'm always looking to improve, and we will be relying on patron support and t-shirt sales, and hopefully get some materials that will increase the quality over time. So I appreciate that. And next up, it's from Hesed Yehu. I hope I pronounced that correctly. But they write, helped me to rethink issues. I'm not a Christian, but I am a Gentile who is a strong classical theist who follows Jewish tradition, the Jewish Bible and its oral traditions. Before I found you, I thought I couldn't be an anarchist because God is ruler. You helped me see that I could still be classed as anarchist while being faithful to God's truth. Thank you for your help and contribution. I appreciate that, and I appreciate you listening to our show from the United Kingdom. So thank you, everyone, for leaving your ratings and reviews. If you're also enjoying the podcast, please consider letting us know by leaving a 5-star rating and review on iTunes or wherever you catch the episodes. Also, you can support the show with a one-time or monthly donation through Patreon. Thank you, Peter, for becoming our newest patron. If anyone else is interested, visit the support tab on anarchochristian.com. That will take you to our Patreon page, where you'll find a few ways that you can support us. So if you like what we're doing, hit the link, check out the options for support, and thank you again, Peter, for your financial support. All right, on with the episode. Again, this is Adam Graham with NoKingButChrist.com, and we are discussing 5 tips for a successful study in foreign policy. I hope you enjoy. And P.S., I was recording for the first time in a different room of our home, and it's somewhat close to where the chickens are in our yard, and if you listen real close, you might be able to hear some roosters in the background. So I apologize for that. It could be a little distracting or just authentic. Either way, I hope you enjoy. All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. And today I'm happy to have Adam Graham on the line. And Adam publishes the website No King But Christ. and all of the articles that are on there, they vary from theologically minded or social commentary and foreign policy. So one of the articles, Adam, that I read recently was your tips for a successful study in foreign policy. And I wanted to just have you on to maybe go over some of those tips, because I think it's so important that in the Christian community and in society in general, we don't pay enough attention to foreign policy. And what, I guess before we get into it, what I guess inspired you to write it? Was it something that you noticed as well? That it's not talked about enough? Or I know in our circles that people talk about it, but yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. No, pleasure to be on. I've been enjoying Anarcho-Christian for a good while now, so it's a pleasure to speak with you. So I had dabbled a little bit in blogging and that sort of thing, and one of my big interests is just kind of learning about everything. And so so it's taken me a while to get here and kind of narrow down what I wanted to do. Of course, that is to say, to narrow down to a handful of things that actually is quite a number of topics. But definitely in the past few years, foreign policy has been kind of my newest frontier. Maybe the final frontier. There's just so much to do with it. I'd say a lot of the things I learn about or want to write about or am passionate about learning about typically do kind of interweave somehow into a burden for definitely something I feel like I need to know, and something that usually reflects kind of the state of the church to some extent. So personally, foreign policy was kind of the outflow of, and I think it happens with a lot of libertarians. A lot of us start with, domestic policy or kind of, things that touch our lives directly. We may have a pet issue. And then sometimes that leads into economics for a lot of people. So I know you've spoken to a lot of people, and of course know many people who are economists or historians. They really like economics. And so I went through kind of an Austrian phase. They're just learning what I can about that, but there's a limit to like how deep you want to go in that. If you don't want to go into policy or anything like that, once you kind of know it, feels like, okay, well, I kind of know enough to be conversant in it. Right. And I can move on. But with foreign policy, there's just so many aspects of it, right? And it's kind of a double-edged sword where, especially if you're an American, and especially an American who is in the church, there's just so bit large of a role that the U.S. has played in, war and peace. Whenever it has the benefit of occurring, just has been so active internationally, and that there's a lot of even just looking at kind of being interested from an American perspective, understanding how America has and even the church as it happens, has kind of played a role in that or been involved in some way. And it's obviously the reason why it comes up so often, and we always have something going on that the U.S. is involved in. So it was kind of, I went that direction. It just seemed like something that was really interesting to learn about. And then as I got into it, it obviously is a large leg of libertarianism if you break it down into kind of what people like to study, what people like to focus on. It's definitely something that is prevalent, but at the same time, very difficult, I think, to get into. And so that's specifically what I had found just getting into, having studied and read into it for a while, and thinking back on how I felt about the idea of even thinking about getting into that area. Some, tips and kind of the way that I got through it, and some things that I would have liked to have heard early on, mm-hmm. things that I had to learn, maybe the hard way, and it's obviously we have a lot of benefit given the internet age, that it's not difficult to come into, that sort of information. But right. I think like it's there in many different subject areas, I suppose. But I feel like given just the huge breadth of history that foreign policy encapsulates, and then just the sheer number of events and peoples that are happening at any given point in time, it can be very intimidating to get into it. And so, for anyone else who thinks they, might be interested in it, but has been kind of wary, maybe, didn't really know where to start. That's what I kind of wanted to do. Ultimately, with the blog as a whole, I think, but specifically with these couple of posts and these tips.
Yeah, and I think that when you are getting into the going down that rabbit hole for the first time, I think that a typical response will be seeing some of the things that you learn about, and you become critical of the foreign policy of whoever it is you're talking about. There's of course a wide range of reasons and actions and why things happen the way that they did, and you end up kind of going down this rabbit hole where if you're focusing on something right now, it easily takes you back, to an event prior to that, and then an event prior to that, and you kind of see where these things all led together. I listen to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast. Do you listen to that?
I have a little bit, yeah. I started into his World War One the series.
Yeah, excellent series. And I think that he makes the point, probably in a few of them, when he's getting started, where he says, like, where do you start? Like, I want to talk about World War One, but it's hard to find a spot where it starts, because then you start talking about this event prior to that led up to this, and yeah. So
yeah, it's a world war. It's a world war, right? It's not a faction war. It's not a Italian city-state war or something. It's a world war. So naturally, you'd think there are a lot of actors, a lot of reasons, a lot of factors that play into how that how that comes about and how it starts, how it ends, that sort of thing. So it definitely is, and so that was my challenge as well. But again, that's how I kind of got in to it. You just. I mean, we'll see. So.
Yeah. Well, no, and that's the thing that's what's great about these tips, though, is that they're not focused on a single event. That they're something that can be applied to any event that's happening now, or if you're studying something that happened in the past. And so, the first one that you have listed here, the first tip, is to identify good resources to follow. And can you expand on that a little bit? How would we identify a good resource?
Yeah, so and you'll see that in some ways it's not too difficult, but in other ways you have to kind of you have to be willing to temper that in other ways to make full use of or find the full breadth of resources. So in some sense, being able to find good resources can kind of be a vague concept. But definitely from a libertarian perspective, we already have a little bit of a grasp, right? So when you know a lot of the key fundamental principles of libertarianism, when you know kind of the worldview, say, that even a conservative is coming from, you can generally start there. If you know the principles are in place, say, of focus on individualism, then you can have a little bit more confidence that a source you're going to that ascribes to those principles will also ascribe to them for foreign policy. So I was kind of first jumped in, I guess, to the deep end when I would hear people like Scott Horton come on to some of the podcasts and shows that we kind of frequent. A lot of libertarians frequent. So he makes his rounds along. He's got his own show and some radio spots and that sort of thing. And they run now, of course. At the time they didn't have that, but now they run the Libertarian Institute. But they also run antiwar.com. So there are obviously some some resources that you may already be using. For instance, if you're starting from, say, you're already looking at things from the Mises Institute, or if you're familiar with Rothbard, as I know you've talked about those guys and kind of that school in previous episodes. You can look at places like Mises Institute will publish a lot of things. If you're a conservative, maybe getting into it, you want a little bit of a trust factor there, and you trust people like Pat Buchanan, or kind of you want a little bit of a conservatism with just a non-interventionist slant, which frankly is the roots of conservatism in America anyway, really, if you study it enough. The American Conservative is one of my it's kind of a more accessible magazine publication. But Buchanan, they'll have a lot of other guys, Peter Van Buren, Phil Giraldi. So, they will publish a lot of those things. There's Daniel Larison I think, may even be one of their head correspondents, or basically authors for foreign policy in general. What you're kind of getting into there is, let's say, you kind of want to build up a network, much like you might, build up a network of friends, or just, jumping around from one topic to another. Anything you can do to start building up that kind of network for yourself of things that you trust and can look for. So sometimes it might be media outlets or different media forms. Sometimes it may be authors in particular, and we talk about that a little bit later on. Obviously, you want to talk to people like other people that might be in, say, the anarcho-Christian group, other groups or individuals you're affiliated with, and try to find for all you can tell, a trustworthy source. And I link to a number of those in the article as well, in addition to the ones I've mentioned here. I obviously have some of my, favorites, some of which are mentioned and some of which are not. But, it's kind of how you get your foot in the door there. I could tell you, again, from, listening to Scott Horton before, generally, has brought on a lot of shows, for that reason. He's just been into it for a long time. You're not, however, going to be able to avoid that initial shock factor, I think, of what happens whenever you jump into these things, is that you just hear so much that you don't have a way to grasp, And it's a little bit different than many other subjects, because, I'm sure I don't feel so much that way anymore. But early on, it would just feel like I was maybe in a foreign country or something,
Right.
The names that I would hear reference, the places, the events. It's just an onslaught of, new information, and it can be very slippery and difficult to grasp and difficult to found, kind of grab onto it in any different way.
Well, and a lot of times that information comes across as drastically different or the opposite story that you may have already heard and grown up with.
Yeah, I felt like I was listening to conspiracy theorists all the time.
Right.
I was sitting there. And frankly, that's actually a pretty big social pressure mechanism, I think. I don't know if it comes across in education. Maybe it's a cultural thing in general. Of course, we know from probably from a lot of the guests you've had on, and anyone who's been a libertarian for a while will notice that, what you learn as a child, what many other people, believe about the state of, things, state of current issues or history or the way things happened in the past, the way things are now, and the way that they feel about them is, it can be very difficult, from just a peer pressure, social pressure type of perspective to differ from that, And when you get into the guys, if you're looking at resources that are and authors or speakers who are very educated in those areas, it can be a lot at once. So we're not just talking about, I'm not sure that World War II had to happen the way it did. We're talking about the entire foundations of what you assume are true about war and about terrorism and and diplomatic relations and world history and stuff. You're talking about real ground shaking things. It can be very scary.
Yeah.
Not even from just a learning perspective, but from a social perspective.
Right.
Just being able to speak out to that.
I think you mentioned
struggle is real.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. When you find those resources, you've mentioned some great names. I follow those and completely agree which ones are, jumping into the deep end and which ones are maybe, like you mentioned, listening to Pat Buchanan or the American Conservative can be a little bit more of an easier walk into it. And so I think that was a great tip on identifying those good resources as a good list of them. Now, number 2, you split into 2 parts, and it's to study broadly and to study deeply. So can you go over, I guess, what you mean by, by studying it in these ways? What do you mean by that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I can't recall why I had to split them out or why I felt that I needed to split it out, but I think it's just because I had, when you're thinking about acquiring, knowledge just in such a multitude of, facets to it and different ways to approach it, sometimes you don't know whether or not you should read kind of a large survey, work, or whether you should focus on a particular event, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And I saw that even learning other, aspects of history or libertarianism, advantages to both, but then where there was a real synergy to both, Mm-hmm. And so I don't know if I would have one approach for everyone. But I definitely, recall some situations that, like some ways in which I kind of interface with that myself when I was learning. I think I mentioned a number of years ago I kind of embarked on it's maybe like a little millennial thing that sometimes people think they're going to do, especially conservatives. I'm going to read about the presidents, but so I decided at some point, which I have since abandoned, that I was going to read, a biography, nothing huge, just a short biography on all the presidents, so I would just know kind of, what to, know a little bit about each one, what was happening at the time. So, I went into that thinking I was going to learn about these, these figures of the past. Maybe I'd like some, maybe I wouldn't like some, but I don't know. It turns out you can't necessarily fill full books with these people's lives, but what they even had to do so that you could, approach understanding who they were and what they did was they had to talk about a lot of other things, right? They had to talk about, the world in which they were born and the world in which they kind of, interacted with it. So of their youth and their adulthood. They had to talk about the people that they had to do those things with, whether it was their family or their friends or their, in the case of presidents, the people that were in their cabinet or people that came before them or after them, that sort of thing. What I found was that even just reading some of those early presidential biographies, I was struck more with what I was learning about America and American politics more than I had ever really cared to learn about their lives.
Yeah.
That really wasn't the important part for me. And so I think that would be an example of studying kind of deeply and thinking you're going to focus on this one person and really learning just a whole lot, all these other aspects about the environment they were in, the time in which they lived, that sort of thing. So I think that could definitely happen with foreign policy as well. So, you could certainly go in the sense of like pick a biography or something. That's certainly not a bad way to go about it. I'd say there was another example, kind of an illustrative example of maybe studying broadly and being surprised at kind of how that guided me was I was reading, I think it's Susan Fink's book on the Cold War. A little nerdy tidbit for me. So I really like Metal Gear Solid series of video games. So, sue me if some of your listeners aren't. I have a suspicion that some other, listeners might resonate with that. That was actually kind of growing up with those. Obviously, I wasn't always studying foreign policy or reading these things, but they were always infused with like this Cold War ethos of just, the different factions and all
true.
these events and places and dates and everything. And so it really kind of had this mythology around it that obviously is not completely true, but will give you kind of a curiosity for it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so somewhere in there, I wanted to find a Cold War history that kind of looked at the international landscape. Because when you look into the Cold War, you think, especially from an American history perspective, you just can't go into it all, but you see it as like all these just pitting of, America escalates and the Soviet Union escalates, and there's these, just this slow, steady, buildup.
Yeah.
But what you actually see is these real tiny micro conflicts all over the world. Really, everything is kind of driven by this clash of civilization, as they would call it. And so I wanted to get a little bit more into like the smaller conflicts.
Sure.
The things in Africa and the Middle East and these kind of smaller theaters of the Cold War, I guess you could say.
I agree. So we kind of get introduced to the Cold War, but we don't look at who was USSR, what Cuba had anything to do with it. We kind of just, I think for myself at least, growing up, you just kind of take that information for granted, and that's it. That's all that it is,
Yeah, it's a very much, people, places, great men type of mentality when you're studying. And of course, you can't get into all that in grade school, so it's somewhat understandable. But it certainly leaves you wanting for extra information, right? And so, I don't know exactly what I was expecting out of that book, but it helped me to establish, I'd say, a timeline between a number of things. So the beginning to the to the early 90s. And then put into a lot of perspectives of a little bit more of a narrative to what was going on there, which is good because obviously from grade school, like you said, we were kind of left with a little bit of those milestones and landmarks, but we don't know how they're tied together really.
Right.
So that was helpful, and just that kind of lays a little bit more of a foundation that I could then go into and pick out certain, things that I wanted to dive deeper into. And so I think a good approach, would be whether you start with one or the other, as far as if you want to look at like a broad-reaching kind of summary survey history versus look at a particular conflict or a particular issue or something, is just alternate. Try to alternate between those two, unless you really want to specialize in one particular area. But when I think about the way that I go about just establishing a real recallable knowledge or a real good perspective on any topic really, but especially foreign policy, is that you think about it in terms of landmarks and being able to tie them together and understand the landscape of, and this plays a lot into geography, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But if you think about it, if you move to a big city or something and all you're going to know about is where you live, and maybe you'll, figure out where you work, right? But you don't know what's in between. You don't know who lives where you are, where you work. You don't know any of the other, areas. And so, you might branch out and learn about a restaurant, and then you'll find out how to get there and what's in between. And so you'll pick up different aspects of one from studying the other.
Yeah.
And especially with the studying broadly, it gives you a little bit of a better, you might not actually feel like you came across learning a whole lot that is very actionable for you. But at the same time, it exposes you to a number of different times and people and places and everything that then you might want to study more deeply. Absolutely. And so, and just things that jump out, with a lot of these other survey works, like if they break them out topically or something. certain examples. You've got a number of them on your on your bookcase there that you could easily branch in there.
Yeah.
A lot of good ideas. So, so what I wanted to basically illustrate there is just that it's not wrong or right to do one or the other, but you definitely want to use them for the tool that they are, and they definitely complement each other over time.
Absolutely.
As you kind of develop your sensibility of what you have a passion for, what you have a burden for, being able to learn more about, to really get that broad depth, if that's what you're looking for.
Yeah. And with your list here, I'd never seen it put into a list of tips. And as I was reading it, I was kind of looking at my own journey into this information and into history, and seeing where along the lines that I may have done that, but didn't realize it. And one thing that came to mind was when I got into the broadly and deeply tip, that it reminded me of a time where I was working nights, and I did a lot of driving, and so I've always been someone who listened to talk radio. And at that time, I would listen to those right-wing guys hollering about stuff, during the day. And when I started working more of the night times, those guys weren't on so much. But I did listen to NPR a lot. And now NPR, it can be criticized just as much of having a slant in the other direction. But it reminded me of the studying broadly, and where listening to the voices from the right and people that would be considered voices from the left started to kind of give me a different perspective on some things. And even further into that, started listening to BBC, because they would play BBC news segments, late at night. And so hearing things from another country's perspective as well was a little bit different, and that would inspire me to look into some of the topics that they were talking about, going a little bit deeper into those specific topics, whatever it was that I was listening to that day. And so that's what it really, that's what I recalled when I was reading your tip 2.
Mm-hmm.
And then you mentioned geography, which happens to be number 3. Mm-hmm. So study world geography. I agree. That is very important. And, but tell me, why would you include it in this list?
Yeah. So I think, I don't know what it is. I think there's a little, like a trope for people who are overseas. They say America doesn't really know anything about geography. And generally, they're probably correct.
Yeah.
I mean, you could probably, I know I've seen YouTube videos or social media videos of, people asking Americans to identify places on a map. Now, I think in general, it's because, frankly, we actually do learn a good deal about, a number of countries, because really the 50 states are kind of separate countries, really. They should be viewed more that way than anything else. But so we already have plenty of countries to memorize in capitals. But obviously, we're over here by ourselves. A lot of people don't need to leave, whereas the international dynamic is just, distances are just far different, and the sort of obviously, I think the dynamic is different. Given Americans, we just have a lot different physical boundaries in our geography than do Europeans or Africans or any of this. But it definitely is, I think, an artifact of, if you did not, pay attention in world geography class, or if you had a gym teacher, teach geography as a second class or whatnot, and it maybe wasn't really engaging for you, is that I really feel like it's kind of a physical language that until you learn it, I'm just missing a lot, through the reading. So, and it has a lot to do, like, even just with American history, even would play into that a lot if you don't know how to interface with it. So it's a little bit akin to that broader, language concept. If someone is trying to explain to you something, but you don't know where any of these places are. Imagine, again, going into like a city or something, they're telling you to turn right here on this street and, go forward here till you see this tower or something. You don't even know what to do with any of that, right?
Yeah.
And so maybe people aren't coming from an ignorance of world geography like I was. And it's hard to put myself back in that place, having already done it. But, for instance, in that World War I history, right, when Dan Carlin's talking about Germany needing to get to France, but France has these forts built all up along the border. They can't get through that. That's not a way to go. And they can't go any other way except through Belgium. Well, if you can't visualize what that looks like on a map, it's kind of difficult. You just say, oh, well, Germany invaded Belgium, and that brought in the British and, sparked off all these other conflicts. Mm-hmm. But it felt like when I was reading, and it was really illustrated for me most by that, I think it's kind of what compelled me to start learning it, is when I was reading that Cold War history. You can imagine from an international perspective that's even worse. It's magnified because they're talking about Ethiopia or, talking about Central African countries or South America or Latin America. There's just so many places. If you don't know spatially where that, where those things are, or what the relationship is with them, or, so much of, I don't know if maybe, given the urban nature of culture, at least in America these days, we don't need it so much, need to know where our rivers are, or, just we're so far removed from that, but so often, in other, areas and especially historically, landmarks or special places, cities or borders, traditional borders or rivers or these different mountains, or all these different, elements of geography play a lot into the sorts of reasons why people have conflicts historically in foreign policy. And so, being able to just visualize wherever it is that you are, whatever it is you're studying is, based in, and being able to see those things in your mind just adds a whole new level. And I think kind of unburdens your mind a little bit, because when I used to read those things, I think I used to wonder, exactly where that was in relation to, each other, the different actors or something. But my mind could never resolve it, And so now having that language to be able to speak, just to be able to see it, just makes it so much more real. Instead of reading, I think a lot of history can come across as a lot of fiction almost, because we can't grasp it in any way, but really getting an idea of where these people are, where these places are, really helps to drive it that these are real people and real places and things that actually happen. And I think that really also plays into just an empathic, aspect to libertarianism, which, a lot of people would think is actually missing. So people would call you heartless or something, not think that you really care about individuals, when in fact libertarians typically, I think, have a greater respect and a greater value for individuals than most other political affiliations. So
I agree.
Again, I think it just really roots your study and roots history and politics in a way that just wasn't there for me, certainly. So I don't know, hopefully other people, will resonate with that. But if you haven't done it, if you feel like maybe you need to brush up on a little bit, I would encourage it. So
absolutely,
definitely helped me a lot.
Absolutely, and you brought up the man on the street interviews, and those are always entertaining. And I'm sure that some of them are set up in a certain way to give us those moments of entertainment. But I think overall, we don't know a lot of some of those smaller countries in the Middle East or in Europe. If we can't show where they are on the map, it does call into question, as you mentioned, the empathy that we could show toward a group of people that we don't know not only do we not know anything about them, but we do not know where they are on a map, pointing to a little colored, spot on a map. So we actually, we homeschool and have a big wall map. And once we put that up, it actually made some of our conversations just go that much faster. And it's exactly what you described, where you're talking about Germany and France and Belgium. And I catch myself just kind of explaining something. and then I say, you know what, let's just go to the other room, and we go to the schoolroom with the map on the wall and just then point to it. It makes it so much easier, and then as you said, to imagine if you were in that situation, if you were in Belgium, if you were in France, if you lived in this section, and this was happening, just kind of putting yourself there, and I think when you do know that that's a legitimate area, and it's not just a word on a piece of paper, you can put yourself into that situation, and I think it is something that's missing greatly in our conversations.
Yeah, and especially for speaking to Christians in particular.
Yeah.
I've been looking into reading a lot more deeply, kind of in a deep cycle right now with Israel and Palestine, which can be a real tricky, landscape to navigate as well. But naturally, you get a lot of maps and a lot of talk about, borders moving and those sorts of, even though this small area, there's so many towns mentioned and people groups and they'll have different names because they're one name in Arabic and one name in Aramaic or Hebrew. But from just a broad Christian perspective, even learning that those sort of detailed geographical elements of Palestine, or maybe through Italy and through just Eurasia and that sort of thing, that helps, I think, to ground your biblical talking to.
Absolutely.
Because I know I've done the same thing with the Bible, thinking about just reading these places and these areas, and you don't know how to what direction you're going, or
right.
where all these things are. It helps to make the Bible more true for you and more relatable for you if you spend the time in that detailed way as well with geography. Obviously, it doesn't have as broad a scope as our international histories today, but even so, it plays the same sort of role. When you don't know, you can't properly put yourself there. You can't, and it doesn't quite seem real to you. Because you just don't know, really, you can't feel where it is. You can't kind of sense where it is. So, even those advantages, I think, are valuable for the Christian, especially.
Yeah, I totally agree. I completely agree with that, and I think that sums up the geography really well from our American and Christian perspective. Number 4, find a favorite or trustworthy journalist. And to me, this is kind of sticking with our broadly deeply discussions that we've had on these steps. And so, number 1 was identifying, good resources to follow. And so it kind of strikes me as when you find that journalist, that's that kind of deeper, diving a little bit deeper into the resources. And so can you give us some names of journalists that you follow, or I guess go over what it takes to find the journalist, the trustworthy or favorite journalist, and just what we can expect from that.
I think these last tips are a little bit an extension or in relation to the first 3. That's kind of how I structured it out. So the first was kind of latch on to resources. Now, resources can be authors, but you'll see a lot of times with like news aggregation websites, that sort of thing, that it's a collection, of a lot of different contributors. And so when you know that the resource is trustworthy, you don't have to be so concerned about who's writing for it. So if these guys are principled, they're gonna it's curated to a sense. You kind of know the perspective you're getting. But as you want to continue to specialize, I think that becomes more difficult to do from a just your typical weekly op-ed or current events coverage or something. So if you want to continue moving on, I think that sometimes or often involves breaking out of those traditional curated areas and branching into particular individuals or other outlets. And so I think starting to latch on to particular authors or particular contributors kind of it is its own tip, and then it plays into the fifth tip, which was embracing diversity, which I purposefully made it like the progressive talking point kind of setting, just
Right.
to kind of play off the fact that normally that's not always a value that libertarians will espouse, but it does have some merit from time to time, right? So what you'll find is you alluded to kind of an American perspective or an American almost like sheen that we kind of cast over history and our the details around our foreign policy, right? So you can imagine, say, someone in Israel, Palestine, or someone who grew up there, or comes from another one of those cultures, a Jewish author or a Palestinian author, or they're going to have a very different perspective. They're coming directly from the source, so they have a lot of perspective to add. Doesn't mean that they're more objective per se. They might be more biased toward one side or the other. But they're going to have a perspective that's completely lacking a lot of what Americans will just read into things like that, right? And so you're not typically going to find that perspective in those traditional, more mainstream outlets. So what you'll have to do a lot of times that I've found is have to identify particular authors that, and this is most important, that they're probably lacking the American political perspective too, right? So you're going to find, take a well-known individual like Noam Chomsky or something, right? Mm-hmm. Not really someone that any libertarian would think, oh, I need to read some Chomsky because he's going to have so much value to add to my libertarian political views, right? But a lot of those guys are very good when it comes to war because they're starting from a perspective of kind of an empathic individualism that they do recognize. They might be kind of sympathetic to some state actors, but they do have it may have come from Wilson, a Wilsonian type of self, ability to kind of determine, be free to have their rights to self-determination, that they have. So, so what the easy way to kind of get into that, I think, is to start to notice who is covering areas or that you like from a lot of those news outlets. So, for instance, I'll see. I mentioned Daniel Larison before. If you like the American Conservative, and you say, "Okay, I like what Daniel Larison does." He'll typically touch on Yemen a couple times a week, that sort of thing. So, of course, he is, I think, a domestic correspondent covering foreign issues. What you'll typically find a lot of times is if you're going to cover, let's say you want to cover Syria or something, a lot of your actual information that is going to be useful to you to really get more in depth with that is someone who actually writes in Syria.
Right.
So, for instance, I was exposed to some of the independent authors, Patrick Coburn, who does get syndicated quite a bit, and Robert Fisk, who I don't actually know how widely he's syndicated, but he's written on it and published in book form, and has his own kind of blog, his own syndication. Now, I'd say neither of those guys are libertarians per se. They would have a very libertarian view if you were to ask them about it, maybe about Syria as a conflict or something. I know Robert Fisk. I have some of his read some of his other work. Would definitely not be a libertarian, but they get war right. And so what I find is that a lot of people who cover foreign policy, I don't know if they know that, like they know that they're speaking to a broad audience, or it just doesn't come up. Right. Because frankly, they're in the field. They're usually reporting directly on that. Those kind of domestic issues just aren't a concern for them. They're not dealing with it. So they might, again, if you got them for coffee and asked them, they might tell you, how they feel, but it doesn't come up, in the writing. It's just not as, I'd say a lot of that international work or people who specialize in foreign policy, they don't politicize everything like a lot of American journalists will. Mm-hmm. So that can be good or bad, but so as far as how to kind of interface with that and embrace that, I found that I had to kind of overcome the echo chamber type of mentality that I wanted to have, which was, let's stay in this safe
Right.
this safe media site that I know everything here is for me. You can pretty much read anything on the Mises Institute blogs and know that you're getting good stuff. But as soon as you venture out of that, it's a lot more dangerous and difficult to figure out.
Which kind of gets into step 5, where you talk about embracing diversity.
Yeah, they play into each other, right? And I think you have to do that a lot of times with foreign policy. And again, it's not our first inclination, and there's not even necessarily anything wrong with that. It's just that if you want to continue to get better information in these other areas, there just aren't always people who are libertarians who specialize in those areas. But it doesn't mean that the information is all of a sudden not bad.
Right.
So there's a real element to our partisanship that can be useful for us, but can also hamper real progress in other areas where we want to take the good and leave the bad, which is an equally valuable skill to have. It's more difficult, but I think just as necessary. So.
Absolutely. It's there always seems to be a push, and this is everywhere. You mentioned you sort of form your own echo chamber. It's where it's comfortable. Then there's always this push that from maybe the libertarian or even the conservative side, a pushback on anything that CNN might bring up. So we'll just completely reject it. The same thing might be for Huffington Post. And then from the other perspective, pushing back on conservative things that maybe you read it on Fox. And I think that there's plenty of reason for you to call into question any of those groups. You don't have to convince me, that. But as you're pointing out here, to just flat out reject some sort of information, maybe they did catch that information earlier. Maybe they did. Maybe they have one journalist on staff that is doing a good job in a particular field. That's something that I think as we get so pushed into the left versus right sort of mentality that we do lose out on the diversity that we can get from just listening. Maybe you'll hear that it's completely wrong. But getting a sense of even what that particular side is saying is important.
Yeah, I mean, there's just and definitely recent times are no different in this. With different conflicts that we've had going on. I mean, for instance, we would always hear through a lot of even outlets that should be better. For instance, if you look at Syria or something, it's going to be very difficult for you to have a balanced view on Syria without going outside of mainstream media or even some kind of secondary libertarian media, depending on where you're at. You would not hear you would hear about gas attacks and you would hear about who they think did it. They always blamed on Assad. You would never hear the week-long, the weeks and weeks of study and rebuttal and reasons why that can't be true.
Right.
But you would be left with the impression, because you read the headline, they made the point, they never came back to get it. But the guys who really, focus on these things aren't typically members of those mainstream outlets. They have to get through the curation. That's not always as interesting as the original event. So if you really want to be able to, again, to have that true full view of what's going on, and when you're starting to branch out and really get a deeper understanding and grasp of knowledge in foreign policy, you just have to branch in that. Now, again, it can be difficult then to know kind of what you should trust in, and I think that's probably just like any other subject you're going into. A lot of people are maybe even more accustomed to that. If you're in a field where you have to work with, like if you're in a scientific field or something like that, you're going to be dealing with a lot of different perspectives and adjudicating them. Especially, we cover apologetics in some case, and I've studied a lot of apologetics, and especially in science, but even in other philosophy type topics or whatnot, you're going to get different perspectives, and they will have their, pros and cons, and you will have to basically put them together as kind of a consensus. So, you're then starting to build into some confidence and some discernment and saying, this meshes with other things that I have a fair, a good confidence in their veracity. So when I'm taking on this other person's perspective, he might be biased. He might not even be all true, but I can take the things that I'm reading from these different sources and I can compile them together and try to fit out, the perspective that seems most credible.
Yeah.
And, again, it's getting into the deep stuff. It's not shallow stuff. You can, stick with the kind of more broad views on those things. You can get your conclusions right, and you don't always have to go deep into things. But when you're getting on that kind of more bleeding edge of these topics, you do have to, start to put things together like that, and it won't all be cut out and dry for you.
Yeah.
It should actually tell us that truth is a little bit more hairy than that anyway. So if we're truly taking everything we read from certain sources at face value, that's definitely not always a good policy to have anyway. So it's kind of unmasking the true lack of confidence that we should have in a lot of other cases, but definitely was something I felt and really had to push through, when I was branching out and really trying to just broaden my horizons in foreign policy.
Well, I agree. I think that even if you do set out, just the act of kind of setting out to learn more information on any topic, you will, I think, eventually start going into the deeper sides of it, and that is where I think these tips are extremely helpful. It is a very good brief introduction into the ways to kind of retrain, in some cases, retrain your mind on the way that you're going to look into this information, or to just have this in mind when just setting out if you've never really thought about it. And I really appreciate you going over this list today, and I'll have a link to the original. It's 2 articles. You have it broken up, and 1 and 2 on one article, and then part 2 had 3, 4, and 5. And I'll have a link in the show notes to those. I think that they're incredibly helpful. I think that this episode is going to be incredibly helpful for our audience that may already be getting down the rabbit hole a little bit, or have been interested. And I really appreciate you taking the time to go over this today.
Absolutely, thank you. Yeah, I mean, if you're thinking about it, if you're hesitant to it, just jump in. Feel lost, feel confused. Don't resist it. Just jump in, deal with it. It will get better. I promise you. If you're in the middle of it, it gets better. It does. It's a unique beast, but it's totally attainable, and the rewards of it are just infinitely valuable. So. Definitely thanks for having me on. I hope a lot of people draw some value from it. And it's been a pleasure.
All right. Thanks, Adam.
Thanks.
All right. I hope you enjoyed that. Let me know if you've had a similar experience in studying foreign policy. Did we miss any tips that you would give to someone that's just beginning to study it? Or are you new to it and have been helped by these tips? Let us know your thoughts on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, or iTunes. Leave us some ratings and reviews, or think about supporting us through Patreon. If you're interested in grabbing copies of any of the books from the authors that we mentioned, I will have an Amazon link in the show notes. If you use the link, Anarcho-Christian will receive a small commission with no additional charge to you. And while you're there, be sure to check out some of our t-shirts and hoodies. So, until next time, grace and peace, no king but Christ.
Thank you for listening to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast. Subscribe to our email notifications at anarchochristian.com. Like us on Facebook.com/anarchochristian and follow us on Twitter at anarchoxp. Subscribe to our podcast and YouTube to join us next time as we continue to evaluate the relationship between the Christian and the state. No king but Christ.
This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.